Most people think a Supreme Court ruling is something that belongs in a courtroom, not in their mortgage payment, their retirement account, or the interest the government pays on its debt. But that assumption can be dangerously incomplete, because when a Supreme Court decision changes the level of uncertainty surrounding the presidency, the effects don't necessarily stay inside the legal system. They can move into financial markets, Treasury yields, borrowing costs, business confidence, and eventually, household budgets. And that is why the ruling at the center of today's story matters. The key question isn't simply what the Supreme Court decided. The bigger question is what the decision leaves unresolved. According to the framework described in the source material for this video, the court distinguished between conduct connected to core presidential responsibilities and conduct that is personal in nature. That distinction could determine what happens next in the underlying legal proceedings, and markets don't necessarily need certainty to react. They react to changes in uncertainty, so if you're a homeowner, an investor, a retiree, or simply someone trying to understand where interest rates and the economy could be heading, this is the part you need to pay attention to. Because the most important financial consequence may not be the headline everyone is talking about. It may be the uncertainty that remains after the headline disappears. Once you see the numbers clearly, you'll understand why this matters more than most people realize. Let's zoom out first. The story being presented here is not simply a political story. It is a story about institutions, risk, and the price financial markets assign to uncertainty. When investors believe that an institutional conflict could become severe or unpredictable, they can demand additional compensation for holding certain assets. That compensation can show up through interest rates, bond yields, risk premiums, and ultimately borrowing costs. Now, this is where we need to be careful. The source transcript estimates that an institutional uncertainty premium embedded in Treasury yields may have declined from roughly 20 basis points to around 14 basis points. Following the ruling, that 6 basis point difference sounds tiny. But finance is full of numbers that look tiny until you multiply them across millions of households or trillions of dollars. 6 basis points is 0.06 percentage points. For an individual household, that isn't necessarily life-changing, but across a massive pool of debt, even a small change in financing costs can become economically meaningful. The source material illustrates this with a $300,000 mortgage. At roughly 6 basis points, the annual difference is around $180 under a simplified calculation. That doesn't mean every homeowner automatically saves $180. Mortgage payments depend on the loan structure, interest rate, term, timing, and whether the rate is fixed or adjustable. But the example demonstrates the larger principle. Small changes in borrowing costs can become large when they're multiplied across the entire economy, and that's where the second number becomes more interesting. The transcript estimates that the remaining 1/4 basis point premium, applied broadly to a very large pool of Treasury obligations, could represent tens of billions of dollars in additional annual interest expense. Again, that should be treated as an estimate, not a government invoice or a guaranteed market measurement. But the economic mechanism is real. When the government has to pay more to borrow, the cost doesn't simply disappear. Eventually, higher interest expenses compete with other government spending priorities. And when households borrow at higher rates, more of their income goes towards servicing debt instead of consumption, saving, or investing. That is why financial markets pay such close attention to seemingly small movements in interest rates. But now we reach the part where most people can get caught. The Supreme Court framework does not necessarily mean the underlying legal uncertainty disappears. In fact, the source transcript argues that the uncertainty changes form. Before the ruling, the question was broader. Could presidential conduct be protected from criminal consequences under certain circumstances? After the ruling, the question becomes narrower. Which specific conduct qualifies as official presidential conduct, and which conduct is personal? That distinction matters because a legal framework can provide clarity without providing a final outcome. Think about it this way. Imagine you are driving toward a destination, and the road signs suddenly become much clearer. You now know which roads are permitted, but you still haven't arrived, and that's essentially the distinction being made here. The framework may be clearer, the final destination is not, and that is why investors could continue watching the lower court proceedings. The source material points to allegations involving testimony, document handling, evidence, preservation, and communications. Those allegations should be understood as allegations, unless and until established through the legal process. The important economic point is that additional hearings, rulings, filings, and legal developments can create new information for markets to process, and markets process information continuously. That brings us to the first major divide. There are two ways households can respond when uncertainty rises. The first is the reactive household. This household sees a dramatic headline, assumes the worst, changes investments, impulsively, locks in decisions based on emotion, and then reverses course when the next headline arrives. The second is the strategic household. The strategic household doesn't pretend uncertainty doesn't exist. Instead, it asks a different question. What part of my financial situation is actually exposed to this uncertainty? If you're holding a 30-year fixed mortgage, your exposure to a short-term Treasury yield movement may be very different from someone shopping for a new mortgage today. If you're holding short-duration Treasury securities, your interest rate exposure is different from someone holding a long-duration bond fund. If you're retired and drawing from investments every month, your risk is different again. And if you're 30 years old and still building wealth, your biggest advantage may actually be time. This is why broad economic headlines can be misleading when they're disconnected from personal circumstances. Let's take a homeowner. Suppose you're considering buying a home and the mortgage rate available to you changes by a fraction of a percentage point. You may think that's not much, but over a large loan and a long repayment period, the cumulative difference can become meaningful. Now compare that with someone who already has a low fixed-rate mortgage. The same economic development may have almost no immediate effect on that person's monthly payment. That distinction is critical. The economy is not one household. It's millions of households with completely different financial positions. Now consider investors. A change in Treasury yields can affect bond prices, and the impact tends to differ depending on maturity. Shorter duration instruments generally have less sensitivity to interest rate changes than longer duration securities. That means two people can own bonds and experience very different results from the same market event. This is the point where financial literacy becomes more valuable than prediction. You don't need to know exactly what the Supreme Court, Congress, the Federal Reserve, the bond market will do next. You need to understand what you're exposed to. And that leads to the most important question in this entire story. What happens next? The source material describes the lower court as the next major stage, where the Supreme Court's framework would be applied to the specific facts. If subsequent decisions narrow the remaining uncertainty, markets could respond positively. If new legal developments increase uncertainty, the risk premium could move in the opposite direction. That means the financial impact isn't necessarily a single event. It can become a sequence of events. And this is where the idea of compounding uncertainty becomes important. A single headline may create a temporary market reaction, but repeated uncertainty can affect the way businesses, investors, lenders, and consumers make decisions over time. Businesses may delay investment. Households may delay major purchases. Investors may demand additional compensation for risk. Lenders may become more cautious, and government borrowing costs can remain elevated. None of this means the economy automatically collapses. That's an important distinction. A rise in uncertainty does not equal an economic collapse, and a Supreme Court ruling does not automatically determine the direction of GDP, inflation, employment, or the stock market. The responsible conclusion is more measured. Institutional uncertainty can become an economic variable. The size of that effect depends on what happens next. And that brings us to the personal side of the story. If you're nearing retirement, don't make a retirement decision simply because you saw a dramatic headline. Look at your income sources, your fixed expenses, your emergency reserves, and the third portion of your portfolio that could be affected by interest rate changes. If you are a homeowner, determine whether your mortgage is fixed or adjustable and understand when your next refinancing or borrowing decision will actually occur. If you're carrying high-interest debt, remember that the biggest threat to your financial stability may not be a 6 basis point movement in Treasury yields. It may be the much higher interest rate already attached to your consumer debt. And if you're still in your 30s or 40s, your biggest financial advantage may be time. You have the ability to spread investment decisions over decades rather than trying to predict the next 6 months. So what should you actually do this week? First, look at your debt. Write down every balance, interest rate, and monthly payment. You may discover that a seemingly small interest rate change matters far less to your household than the expensive debt you're already carrying. Second, look at your mortgage. Know your rate, your remaining balance, and whether it's fixed or adjustable. Don't let a headline make you refinance without doing the math. Third, examine your bond exposure. If you own bond funds, understand their duration. Don't simply assume that every bond investment responds the same way to interest rate movements. Fourth, review your cash reserves. Periods of uncertainty are exactly when liquidity becomes valuable. Having enough accessible savings can prevent you from selling investments at an inconvenient time. Fifth, separate political opinions from financial decisions. You can have strong views about the ruling while still managing your money objectively. Markets don't care which political argument you personally prefer. They respond to expectations about risk, growth, inflation, interest rates, and future cash flows. Sixth, don't confuse a forecast with a fact. When you hear that markets are pricing something, ask what measurement supports that. Statement: what yield changed? Over what period? Compared with what benchmark? And is the number directly observable or estimated? That simple habit can dramatically improve the quality of the financial information you consume. And finally, think about your future self. Imagine looking back 5 years from now. Would you rather have made a series of emotional decisions based on political headlines? Or would you rather have built a financial system that could withstand uncertainty? That's the real lesson here. The biggest financial mistake isn't always choosing the wrong investment. Sometimes it's allowing external uncertainty to control your behavior. Markets will always have another headline, another election, another court decision, another inflation report, another interest rate decision, another geopolitical event. The households that build lasting financial security aren't necessarily the households that predict all of those events correctly. They're the households that build enough margin to survive being wrong. That is a completely different mindset, and it brings us back to the Supreme Court ruling. The most important question isn't whether this one event will single-handedly send the American economy into collapse. There isn't enough evidence to make that claim responsibly. The more useful question is whether the ruling reduces uncertainty, merely restructures it, or creates a new series of institutional questions that markets will continue to price. That distinction matters, because if uncertainty declines, risk premiums could gradually normalize. If uncertainty persists, borrowing costs and market risk could remain elevated. And if uncertainty expands through additional institutional conflict, investors may demand even greater compensation for risk. The next phase will therefore matter at least as much as the headline itself. For ordinary Americans, that means the right response isn't panic, it isn't complacency either. It's preparation. Know your debt, know your interest rates, know your investment exposure, know your cash needs, and most importantly, understand which parts of your financial life are actually sensitive to the economic risks you're hearing about. Because once you separate the headline from the mechanism, the picture becomes much clearer. A 6 basis point movement isn't the same thing as an economic collapse. A legal ruling isn't the same thing as a recession, and uncertainty isn't the same thing as financial disaster. But small changes in financial conditions can compound over time. That's why paying attention matters. Not so you can predict tomorrow's headline, but so you can make better decisions when tomorrow's headline arrives. And there is one final question I'd like you to think about. Do you believe the Supreme Court framework ultimately reduces institutional uncertainty? Or does sending the unresolved questions back through the lower courts simply extend that uncertainty in a different form? More importantly, how much of your own financial life is actually exposed to changes in interest rates and market risk? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more calm, data-driven explanations of the economic stories that can eventually affect your household finances, consider subscribing. Because the goal isn't to predict every crisis. The goal is to understand the numbers clearly enough that you don't have to panic when the next one appears.